You're connected to a special live edition of All Songs Considered. I'm Bob Boilen.
Tati Nagashima came from Misaki, and he sucked it to me back. Oh, he did it wrong. Oh, Woody Rocky, but it may be what I want. Get back to where you once belonged. Get back to where you once belonged. Get back, Joe.
I was in the airport a few weeks ago and a copy of Rolling Stone caught my eye. Lost Beatles Tapes Discovered was plastered on the front cover. The story was about the recent series of arrests of some music bootleggers and the discovery of over 500 reel-to-reel tapes that were recorded by the Beatles during the making of Let It Be. When I was a teenager back in the 1970s, these tapes were the source of many illegal Beatle bootleg records. The quality was pretty awful. These records with names like Sweet Apple Tracks or Get Backs were a window into the greatest band around. And over the years, these reel-to-reel tapes have been digitally remastered, mixed, and painstakingly pored over by Beatle fans, trying to preserve a bit of musical history. For the next 2 hours on All Songs Considered, I'll share some of these performances with you and talk to my guest, Bruce Spizer, author of a just-released book called The Beatles on Apple Records. Welcome, Bruce.
Hi, glad to be here.
And I'll tell you how you can join the conversation, but first, more Beatles. Bruce Spizer, it's 1969. The Beatles had just released 3 months previous, I guess, the White Album. Mm-hmm. And before that, Sgt. Pepper, Revolver, Going Backwards, and Rubber Soul. And they all were records that used the studio as their tool to make music. That wasn't the case for Get Back.
No, the idea behind Get Back, it really evolved out of the idea Paul wanted the group to perform live again and realized that there wasn't going to be a major tour, so his idea was that they would do a television special.
And they had stopped touring in 1966.
Yeah. The idea was, I think the impetus for it was when they did the Hey Jude video. He really got off on having the studio at Twickenham where the crowd came up on the stage, and there was a real warmth to it.
It's sort of a film studio at Twickenham?
Mm-hmm. Well, James Bond movies were shot there as well. So the idea was that the Beatles would rehearse at Twickenham for a couple of weeks, and then they would do this live concert and film it for a television special. And so on January, the very beginning of 1969, the group gathered at Twickenham Studios to work out some new songs. The idea was that they would do about 8 new songs, and one of the new songs that they tested out before Paul arrived was John's Don't Let Me Down, which we're going to play a bit of.
Let's hear it. Don't Let Me Down.
Don't let me down. Don't let me down. Don't let me down. Don't let me down. I'm in love for the first time. So please don't let me down. Don't let me down. Don't let me down.
It's John on acoustic guitar. What else is going on?
You've got George in the background playing a little bit of slide guitar, in fact. And this was before Paul arrived. When Paul came in, he completely rearranged the song, and Even sometimes on John's songs in the Let It Be sessions, Paul was taking charge. John at the time, quite frankly, was strung out on heroin for a lot of this, and he really wasn't at his best. So for that reason, Paul, by default, sometimes would even arrange John's songs in addition to his own.
And the next coat that was rather interesting on the first day in getting Get Back sessions together was
I've Got a Feeling,
yeah.
which is before, once again, Paul arrives and John's playing it. It almost sounds like a Bob Dylan folk rock song.
Love to hear that.
Yeah.
So this is pretty raw, and then there's George in that day.
Yes.
doing something from the band.
Yeah, George had just gotten
Dylan,
back.
Really.
We'd just gotten back from visiting Bob Dylan and the band over in Woodstock, and he had a very enjoyable experience with that. Even had gone into the studio with Dylan and recorded a few things, and he became a big Bob Dylan fan from those sessions. And I think a lot of times during the session, and particularly that first day, he kind of wondered, what am I doing here? And for that reason, sometimes would break out into a Bob Dylan song called I Shall Be Released.
Any day now.
And I don't think that was by coincidence.
Let's hear some.
Well,
and you hear me during the course of what we'll hear. We'll try to pick through the days here of the recording of the Get Back sessions. We'll try to pick from many of the days. You'll hear George singing a number of Dylan tunes and songs on his guitar that have that sort of feeling, songs that became Let It Down,
All Things Must Pass.
All Things Must Pass. And we'll play some of those for you today. You're connected to a special live edition of All Songs Considered. I'm Bob Boilen. You can email us with questions for Bruce Spizer. He's the author of a new book that's just come out. It's called The Beatles on Apple Records. We're here playing basically mixes of tapes that were found and are fodder for bootlegs for many years. So these are the best quality I'd ever heard. And if you want to, you can write us at allsongs@npr.org. If you want to have your voice on the air and ask your question, send the email to allsongs@npr.org, but put your phone number there, and we'll call you back. That's sort of the shape of the first day. The film crew sets up, the band sort of takes shape, starts playing songs just to sort of get in the groove. I mean, it's just after New Year's Eve.
Yeah, they're having a little bit of a hangover.
That's right. And then we've come to the next day where we hear Paul McCartney.
Paul was the closest physically to the studio, sometimes at Abbey Road, and he'd also had a habit of getting there early, and he did the same thing at Twickenham sometimes. He would get there early and just warm up on piano till the others got there.
And one of the things he was attempting was a version of Adagio for Strings with Samuel Barber.
Something like that, yes.
Composition. Let's hear some of that.
'29 take 1, sync, second day shooting, 5 to 11.
It is not, you get the feeling of being in this nice big room, and he's just sort of trying to hammer out a song. it's a lovely insight.
It is a very private moment, and you feel like you're kind of lucky to be there.
One of the things I remember George complaining about as they were working on these was, and John maybe as well, how early they'd get up. It was such an unnatural thing to have to do.
Their sessions typically they would start in the late afternoon and go on sometimes to 3 or 4 in the morning. So all of a sudden here, because of the television crew, or the film crew, I mean, they had to get there for, like, say, 9 in the morning, and then they would stop work around 5 or 6 at night. So that was almost a complete flip-flop of their normal schedule. One
of the pieces of music that I had never heard before on any of the bootlegs that I had gotten as a teenager was a Lennon and McCartney song called "I'll Wait Till Tomorrow." I don't know much about this tune.
No, it was from the early days. Not a terribly good song, but still interesting to hear.
Yeah, let's listen to a bit of it.
Pete Shelton was saying about I'll wait till tomorrow till you come my way. That's why I sit here alone and I pray. But I'll wait till tomorrow through 1,000 setting sun. I'll wait till tomorrow if tomorrow will come. I've been alone. I don't know where she's gone to. Hey, I may be wrong. But I'll wait till tomorrow through 1,000 setting sun.
Slate 41, take one.
Till tomorrow,
And you hear what these are, if it's not clear. The tapes that were taken were real tapes.
Right. These were on, we call them the Nagra reels. They were on a Nagra mono tape
Nagra's a
recorder.
brand for a tape recorder
machine,
that they used in film.
Yes, and these were like about 15 minutes in length each tape. And there were like 530 of these actual tapes.
One for each
two
camera.
Cameras, right. There were 2 cameras primarily, except for the rooftop concert where they went up to 4. But mainly 2 cameras. And when you had time to change the reels, so while one would run out, the other one would still be running. So you'd have to go back and forth between the reels sometimes to edit to get a complete performance of some of the songs.
And when you hear the man say, "Slate, take..."
Right, it's simply trying to cue for the camera so that... if they were going to use that particular sequence in the film, they'd be able to line up the music to the particular image on the screen. At least that was the idea behind it.
There's a lovely version of a song that never, until Anthology, never made it onto a Beatle album before, and it was a lovely song of George Harrison, which, if depending on how you wanted to look into it, All Things Must Pass, might have been another song as I Shall Be Released was.
Right.
In thinking about
and when George came out with his solo album, it was titled All Things Must Pass, and some people thought, because the solo album was released after the Beatles broke up, that George had written the song about the breakup of the Beatles, but these tapes, of course, prove that's not true. Very early in the sessions for the Get Back album, George demoed the song for the band, and the problem George was having with the group was that, and when we listen to this, you'll hear what we're talking about, that John and Paul didn't seem particularly interested to participate in George's songs. They wanted to participate in their own songs.
Well, let's hear a bit of All Things Must Pass.
And this particular track that we played, the Don't Let Me Down, and before that, Save a Last Dance for Me, actually appeared on what was going to be the Get Back album. This was the one that Glenn Johns put together. And
Glenn Johns was...
And that's who we need to talk about. Paul brought in Glenn Johns to the session as a balance engineer. He wasn't brought in to produce it. Glenn Johns also had a union card for film crews, which meant that he could be there and work with, and that was why he was there rather than the normal EMI engineers. George Martin did not have a union card. He certainly could have been there and was there for some of the sessions, but was not there for the Twickenham sessions for the most part because they were not intended to be recorded.
They were just rehearsals.
They were rehearsals. Now, when they moved to Apple, then George Martin was there for most of those sessions.
Was he the one who got the 8-track recorder?
Yeah, he was. When Magic Alex's equipment didn't work, George Martin sent someone over to EMI and said, bring over 2 4-track consoles, and Apple had an 8-track recorder, and they kind of put it all together and made it work. The other interesting thing about Don't Let Me Down, you notice that John gets to a point where he ad-libs the lyrics. And I listened to every known version of Don't Let Me Down, and there is not a single one where John gets the lyrics right. in the song, including the 45. Now, on the 45, you hear it correct, but what they did was they had to drop in during, I think it's the second verse, the lyrics to get it correct. So he never did get that. And it's a very simple song, but for some reason he could never get that. I could understand Across the Universe,
Right,
but
yeah.
Don't Let Me Down,
Right.
you know.
So we have a bunch of questions, and we'll do this a little later, about the Glyn Johns version of Let It, of Get Back, and the Phil Spector version of Let It Be.
Right, we'll talk about those two different products.
So,
yes.
so for those who are wondering, a little later in the show, we're going to sort of A-B those for you, and you'll be able to hear the difference between two. There was an acetate made of this Get Back record that were the tapes from the 30 days or so of rehearsal and so on.
These weren't so much the 30 days. What happened was Glyn Johns made some mixes from when they moved to Apple, so it's not quite 30. It's more like a 10-day period.
Okay.
And Glyn Johns made some mixes, put them on an acetate, and gave them to the Beatles to listen to. And John was a little careless with his acetate, and it ended up in the hands of a Buffalo disc jockey who put it on the air. And then it ended up, more importantly, in a bigger market in Boston. And the Boston station played it, and people thought this was the Get Back album,
This
which
would
it
have
was
been
not.
when? This would have been in
September 69.
So this is much closer to when Abbey Road came out.
Much closer. So
Let
Abbey,
It Be one.
you can imagine the shock of everyone when you heard these very crude recordings, and all of a sudden Abbey Road comes out, and it's the slickest thing they ever did. It kind of oozed through the speakers. It was so slick.
Where was George Martin during the making of Get Back?
We don't know for sure. He was at a lot of the sessions, but not all.
We see him in the movie.
We see him in the movie, but we know Glyn Johns was at every session, and we know George Martin was at most, but not all. We really don't know what percentage he was actually at. It was a tough time for him. I think in the back of his mind, he was wondering if he was going to ever work with the Beatles again, and he might see the writing on the wall. Glyn Johns has worked with the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and the Who, and maybe, it's time for me to move on and they'll get someone else. And I think he certainly was thinking that.
And some of the things they did, the rock and rolly stuff, sort of, they didn't need the kind of talent that he had become part of the Beatles. And
certainly
what he added to the Beatles. Songs like 20 Flight Rock, for example.
Yeah. It wasn't like they were going to take 20 Flight Rock and then George Martin was going to overdub a harpsichord solo in the middle.
Right. So let's listen to a great version of an old Eddie Cochran song, the Beatles doing 20 Flight Rock.
Well, I got a girl with a wrecking machine when it comes to trucking. She's a queen. Oh, that's on a Saturday night. All over I can hold it tight. And let me up for uptown. The elevator's broken down. But I want to fly me by more. I say, I said, by more. Let it ride. 15 floor, I'm starting to sag. Get to the top, I'm too tired to run. Well, so come on, baby, I'm all alone. I said, oh, baby, we'll have to wait, 'cause I'm rolling down and I walk on by more. I'm ready to drag 15 floor, I'm starting to sag. I'm too tired to run. Yeah. Well, they're going to do this in the middle of the night. Oh, you're mighty sweet. My elevator's moving down. So don't do right. Be right on. I'm on the hunt. I'm starting to sing. 15 before I'm starting to drink. Head to the top. I'm too tired to run.
Someone says this isn't on any hours of my bootlegs, and someone else in the chat room said to remind them a little bit of Run Devil Run.
Yes.
The McCartney project. I have an email here from someone who said that they have your book. It says,
"Oh, good. Nice to know someone's buying it."
Just a quick note on how much I enjoy Bruce Spizer, Bruce's new Apple book. I have numbered copy 69. It's a beauty, especially the photos. In those books, Bruce does 2 mock covers of how the Get Back album might have looked, echoing the Please Please Me cover. Perhaps Bruce could share some of that cover history if you haven't. Well, you haven't already done so. So
we'll go ahead and do so. Yeah, the idea behind the project was that the Beatles getting back to their roots, and they came up with the idea of let's have our picture taken for this at the exact same location that we were photographed for Please Please Me,
which was an office building.
It was the EMI building itself in the stairwell, interior stairwell, and they got the same photographer, Agnes McBean, to take the picture.
I'm sorry, Agnes
McBean.
Right.
And he stood down on the bottom and aimed his camera up at them, and more or less the same angle. They didn't quite perfect that. Mm-hmm. And they stood up there and shot it. And this was going to be the cover for Get Back. Then when Get Back became Let It Be, once again they thought it would be the cover. But then they realized that the Get Back album had become something different. It had become a soundtrack for a movie, Let It Be. So the thinking was, well, this is not a suitable cover. What we need is something that will work well for the movie. So instead they went with a totally different cover for Let It Be, the 4 close-up shots of the Beatles' faces instead. And the album cover was scrapped and forgotten about. Then in the 1970s, early about 72, 73, the Beatles were going to have a hits collection come out. And Alan Steckler, who worked for Alan Klein's ABCO, saw that cover and said, well, this would really be great for the hits collection. And so the cover was actually, the picture actually used for the what we call the Red and Blue albums.
Mm-hmm. And all of that is in a book. If you could sort of randomly open to any page, you could see all these variations on the album covers and so forth that Bruce has carefully documented. Here's the Beatles' Christmas, the red label that was used for the Let It Be record, and many randomly doing this, variations of picture sleeves, of labels, all amazingly documented. I don't know how long it took you to do this. I know there were many before you. Back in my Beatle collecting days, there was a book called All Together Now that sort of
that was the Trailblazer
to do that. It's quite an amazing thing. When Beatle collectors collect things, do you think many try to get them all, or just the firsts of?
A lot of them try to get them all, so they get kind of mad at me in a way because they say, I thought there were only 10 variations, but now you've shown there 14, and I don't have these 4. So, it's a lot of fun putting it together.
Someone asks, Brian from Nashville wants to know, do we think that the tapes we're playing now are the original Nagra tapes or safety copies?
Well, I think the ones that we are listening to probably were from these original tapes that were made, and you can be sure the bootleggers have their own safety copies, but the original tapes is what they recovered in the Netherlands, at least from what I understand.
Let's see, we should probably play a little more music, and one of the things we talked about is how they worked again on many different things. What puzzled me when I listened to these tapes was here they were, at least at some point along the way, thinking that they were going to rehearse to do some live TV show somewhere, perhaps in.
They had exotic ideas. I mean,
I love the one where McCartney had the idea to. Was it Tunisia?
Tunisia. They were going to send Mal Evans out to Tunisia to look at a Roman amphitheater. They were going to have Ken Mansfield scout out locations in the Arizona desert.
But sort of as I listen to these, it's rarely do you feel this cohesive. Okay, here's song 1 we're going to play on this live TV show. Here's song 2. It just goes all over the place. One minute they're playing music from the late 1950s, and then maybe something from their bag of tricks from the early 1960s. Songs that aren't even part of this project pop up. One of them turned up as the very last thing on the very last Beatle record, sort of. Which was...
Paul, a little ditty that he had worked out on guitar called Her Majesty, and we'll play a bit of it because when Paul did it, he didn't really envision it being just a little one-verse song. He only had one verse, but I think he thought he would be able to write more because this thing just goes on and on and on. And we'll play a bit of it until we've heard enough, and then we'll kind of fade it down.
Okay, good.
Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she changes from day to day. wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a very nice girl, someday I'm gonna make her mine.
Yeah, we only need like one.
And she changes from day to day. I wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a very nice girl, someday I'm gonna make her mine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she changes from day to day. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. I wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, someday I'm gonna make her mine. Yeah, someday I'm gonna make her mine.
Yeah, it kind of goes on and on. And the interesting thing about it was that Paul, one morning during the Abbey Road album, went over to the studio and just recorded one simple verse of it and wanted to make it part of the medley on Abbey Road.
Right.
And the way he placed it was you had the song, you had Takes Him Out to Look at the Queen, only place that he's ever been. And so Paul thought, gee, that
right,
will tie in well
That's
with this. We're going to put it in here. But it didn't work. And when they did a test medley, he realized it didn't work, so he yanked it out. And he told the engineer, he said, just throw that away.
They basically cut the tape
and throw it away.
Right.
But the engineer knows, when it came to the Beatles, by that time they knew never throw anything away. Yeah. So he saved it and spooled it. And what happened was they had the test medley, and then after the test medley there was silence of about 15 or 20 seconds, and then what he was told to throw away he put back on. So what happened was when Paul heard the test medley, it was only a test, and then he heard silence, and then Her Majesty came in, and Paul thought, this is great, it's karma, we'll do it.
And you could hear at the beginning when it was the mysterious,
why was this bomb? Right,
this crash, and you could hear, if you actually were to take that tape and stick it on the end of, what was it?
It was the end of Polythene
Pam.
Boom, that's what you
hear. That's what you're hearing at the beginning of that. And that's one of the things of the many zillion things that I enjoyed reading in the Beatles on Apple Records books that you've written. It was quite fun. And in hearkening back, actually, let me do one thing. That we got a nice and a curious email from someone, and it says, it wondered if your guest has any connections with Apple at all. Please urge them, but you don't. But please urge them to release the original Glyn Johns Get Back album with generous bonus tracks. A remixed version of Let It Be is not nearly so interesting. So many of the tracks, Two of Us, I Dig a Pony, would basically be no different. Which that's not quite true in.
Well, I think the point he's making is that the Glyn Johns album is a totally different album, and it is. For instance, and that's not always good, but it makes it interesting. Mm-hmm. For example, Two of Us, the version that Glyn Johns used for Two of Us was kind of an early sluggish version. They weren't doing it as upbeat as they were. Whereas the one that Phil Spector took was the one from the movie itself, and it was much more upbeat. So in some ways, Spector picked better takes than Glyn Johns did. And then in other ways, Glyn Johns' album was better because it had all these wonderful kind of rough-edged gems, if you want to describe them. So,
you made me want to actually hear a bit of those. Though we're jumping ahead to where we thought we might head. Let's listen to a bit of the Glyn Johns cut, and let's listen to a bit of the Phil Spector for a minute.
Okay.
And for
can we do that
for J.M. Dempsey in Texas?
All right.
Let's hear a little bit of that.
on that particular song that the influence of the band is there.
Of the
band, not the
no,
Beatles,
Dylan's.
but the group, the American rock and roll, Canadian American rock and roll combination, the band. George, had, as we had mentioned earlier, just gotten back from hanging out with them and Bob Dylan in Woodstock, New York, and therefore he was really influenced by them, and it showed in this tune in particular.
Who's playing that slide?
Because George at the time was trying to develop his new slide guitar style, which particularly on songs like Something off of Abbey Road, you really hear.
When the Beatles return on Monday, it's January 6th. They're still in Twickenham in the film studios there. One of the things that many people talk about these sessions is that, you hear these tapes and you can hear the Beatles just breaking up and falling apart.
Yeah, and there is tension, obvious, and I think a lot of that is because of one particular scene in the Get Back, or in the Let It Be movie, where Paul and George get into a bit of a fight regarding the song Two of Us, where Paul is telling him he's playing it too complicated, and George disagrees, and then Paul says, well, it's kind of like in Hey Jude, whether you should play guitar throughout, and I don't think we should. Finally, George says, look, I'll play whatever you want me to play, or if you don't want to play at all, I won't play at all. Whatever it takes to please you, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And that scene really stinks out. But one of the things you overlook is that sometimes they did have fun just cutting loose with some oldies. There were a lot of oldies that they did, and we're going to cue up one in a minute.
Sure to
for
Fall
us.
was
Sure
a
to
great
Fall
one.
was fun, and plenty of them. We'll go ahead and listen to
Let's
that.
hear that.
Sync Slate 78.
So, you can tell that they, we're having kind of fun in the studio. The other fascinating thing about these tapes, though, is that there's certain songs that we get to hear them in their embryonic stage, where certain songs were really developed in the studio themselves, where Paul, in particular, on Get Back, came to the studio with very little in mind. It wasn't like he had written a song that had two verses and a chorus or anything, and he just kind of fiddled around in the studio, and they kind of fell into it.
I'd love to hear some. We're going to hear a whole lot of probably over the course of the 2 hours, different variations of Get Back. But there's one from that date, from the January 6th date in Twickenham, that I thought was rather interesting. And the couple, that's what they would do. They'd be rehearsing. So let's hear a couple of them in a row.
Sure.
Skip through a few of them. Beatles, Get Back. Write to us at allsongs@npr.org if you'd like to ask a question. Put your phone number there if you want us to call you and get on the show. And if we want to, you can hear in the guitar is
it's Paul's basically playing acoustic guitar. George is faking it on electric, not really knowing where Paul's going with it. Paul's kind of doing some scat vocals because he really doesn't have any words.
And then a little later on, we hear just later that day.
Later that day.
That was great from back in the
kind of interesting. You can see that now he's got the Get Back. He has some of the lines such, was another woman, thought she was another man. He hasn't given a name to that character yet. And also you had the backing vocals on the Get Back was Ringo singing backing vocals. Yeah, Ringo wasn't at his drum kit at the time, so he just walked up to a mic and was singing some back. And you can hear John kind of talking in the background because he wasn't really into the song at that point in time.
Let's hear some more from later that same day in Twickenham in the Beatles. Get Back.
You can hear how totally different the song is. You have George on a wah-wah guitar, using the wah-wah pedal,
and oftentimes you hear it, I think, through a Leslie speaker, too, a very swirling sort of sound.
So he was just experimenting with things. Ringo's using a very straightforward drum beat. He hasn't come up with a very inventive drum beat that he used for Get Back, that kind of galloping sound. But also, they kept going back to the oldies. They loved doing the oldies, and throughout the entire sessions, they would go back and do something like, literally rock and roll music by doing Chuck Berry's rock and roll music.
Look, you want to give a listen to a little bit of rock and roll music from that day, and it's January 6th, and it's the Beatles on All Songs Considered. You'll hear him doing various accents of just to make up words.
Yeah, a lot of scat vocals and a lot of fun stuff. And that you'll hear throughout the entire sessions. Some of it's fun. There was talk about doing an album of the rock and roll oldies on it, and while it sounded good on paper, the problem was when they listened to the tapes, they realized they really didn't have an album's worth of high quality oldies. No.
I don't think there were but 2 or 3 songs where they got all the words right.
Yeah, I think on Anthology that they had about the best of the rock and roll, and that was just about all you really could have released.
Although Lennon went ahead and Stand By Me and other favorites.
He did his own.
Really nice.
Yeah, he did his own rock and roll album, Down the Road, Return to His Roots.
One of the things that I think that if you lived through the time that was a bit confusing was that Let It Be was a record or a project that started in 1969 after the White Album. But for Beatle fans, really the album that they heard was Abbey Road.
Yeah.
And
things got put on hold. And we'll talk more about that as the show goes on, but they weren't really happy with the album that they had thrown together from these sessions, and then went back in the studios to do another polished album, such as Abbey Road.
With George Martin.
Yes, George Martin at the helm. And but some of the songs on Abbey Road had their roots in the Get Back sessions, and one of the ones we're going to do right now was She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, which actually did start during the Get Back sessions.
And so let's hear it, and we hear a really sort of much slower version of She Came In Through the Bathroom Window then, don't we?
1, 2, 3, 4. She came in through the bathroom window, protected by a silver spoon. Of her own lagoon.
It's so good to hear that in such an early form, but it's all there.
Oh, yeah. He's got most of the lyrics worked out by that time, yes.
And on that day, or maybe it was the next day, maybe it was the January 8th session, we hear a tune by...
Another one by John, Mean Mr. Mustard. And what happened here was that John was coming up with some bits and fragments of uncompleted songs, and Mean Mr. Mustard was one of them, and ultimately it ended up in the Abbey Road medley, so rather than them being totally wasted... And one way of looking at it, you might say John was just too lazy to finish the songs, and maybe that was the case, but it worked real well for the medley anyway.
Love to hear Mean Mr. Mustard.
Mean Mr. Mustard sleeps in the park, shaves in the dark, trying to save paper. He sleeps in a hole in the road. He keeps a 10-bob note up his nose. He's saving up to buy himself clothes. He's such a mean old man. He's such a mean old man. Oh, mean Mr. Mustard. Mean Mr. Mustard. Mean Mr. Mustard. His sister Shirley works in the shop. She never stops. She's a go-getter. He takes him out to look at the Queen. The only place that he's ever been. She always shouts out something I've seen. He's such a mean old man. Such a mean old man.
Now, one of the things you may have noticed in there that when John was talking about Mean Mr. Mustard's sister was his sister Sherry. Now, he later, for Abbey Road, changed it to his sister Pam,
Right.
because it tied him with Polythene Pam. So that was why that change was made.
Just going nowhere, spending someone's heart and pay. You and me Sunday driving, not arriving on our way back home. We're on our way home.
And this is the Glyn Johns version, the slower version. If we move it on up, we can hear Phil Spector's choice of his the version of Two of Us that he picked. Let's hear it. That's the version that everybody.
Yeah, and it is a much better version.
It is much.
Bear in mind that was recorded on the very last day of the session. So the point
Which
being...
was what date?
January 31st. So the point being, by that time, the Beatles had nailed these songs down, and Phil Spector used a lot of songs from the rooftop sessions, which once again were the second to last day.
Yeah.
So Phil Spector's thinking was, I'm looking for the best performance, whereas Glyn Johns' thinking was, I'm looking for the most interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
And
Glenn
the
was sort of
difference.
in the middle of it. He'd seen it and heard it
Right.
all, and maybe was too close to it. Whereas, although I must say, when I bought the record, it was my first disappointing Beatle record I ever bought.
Yeah, I listened to Two of Us, which was the opening song, and I was all excited
Yeah,
about it.
yeah,
This
yeah.
sounds great. And then all of a sudden, Long and Winding Road, and I was about to throw up. It was horrible.
Yeah, it was a
What
disappointment.
happened?
I'd like to play more of the comparisons between the Spector, and that's what a lot of the people who are writing us are asking for, to play the Glyn Johns mix, bit of the Phil Spector, but more the Glyn Johns, what that was all about. But there's a lot of stuff that people haven't heard at all, and songs and versions, and when I spent the last few weeks of my life going through and listening to this material.
Boy, do I know that feeling.
And it's hard work, eh?
It is.
So one of the wonderful things was this really old McCartney tune that McCartney talks about in books, having written as one of the first songs he ever wrote. It's called I Lost My Little Girl. And here we have John Lennon singing on it. And it's just sort of sweet.
Woke up late this morning, little girl, yes I had, that very last evening, Friday night. I woke up late this morning, my head was in a whirl. Only then I realized, lost my little girl, ladies and gentlemen. Is there a doctor in the house? Yeah. I want you to tell me. Oh, expensive. Hair didn't always curl. No, that's right. Cause I know that she's always gonna be my little girl, even though I lost her, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, I woke up late this morning. Only my head was in a whirl. It's only then that I realized, hey, I'd lost my little girl. Her clothes were not expensive, ladies and gentlemen. Her hair didn't always curl. It didn't always curl. But one thing I realized when I realized I'd lost her, that is, I realized I'd lost my little girl. Can you dig it? Hey, I woke up late this morning.
I think that's really sweet.
Yes, indeed.
And back to that era, too, one of the things that John seemed to be looking at was a version of, well, the Beatles' first.
Yeah, this is a real tough one because the idea of the Beatles redoing for fun Love Me Do, and on paper, I mean, this is going to be great, and why hasn't Apple released it? We'll play it for you now, and then you'll probably hear why Apple hasn't released it. Yet I'm glad that through the magic of bootlegs and NPR, we can hear it.
Thank you.
Let's say we got a really good one of Love Me Do.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please.
You can see why Apple will probably never release that.
Love Me Do. You're connected to a live special edition of All Songs Considered. I'm Bob Boilen. All Songs Considered, for those of you who've never been with All Songs Considered before, is a show that generally features artists that no one has ever heard before.
Like the Beatles.
Like the Beatles. And we decided to do something very different for this show. But if you love music and grew up on music or fell in love with music at any point in your life, and can't find it on your radio anymore, All Songs Considered is, well, that's the heart and soul of what we do. Today we're doing a special on what is called the Lost Beatles tapes that were recovered in a raid recently in Amsterdam. They have been the fodder for bootlegs for years, and we're playing basically versions from those bootlegs and giving you a glimpse into the Beatles in a period that they were both having a lot of fun and a lot of tension. Their manager, Brian Epstein, had died. The group was sort of searching for new direction, trying to find a new spark. And
the great thing about these is when you hear all the horror stories about the Let It Be sessions, when you listen to this, you realize they were having fun.
They really were.
And then also, they did some great songs.
Mm-hmm. My guest is Bruce Spizer, author of a book called The Beatles on Apple Records. If you care to email us, and many of you have, and we're trying to answer them, if not directly, indirectly in conversation here, it's allsongs@npr.org. If you want to ask us a question by phone, we can now do that. You can put your phone number in the email, and then we'll call you back. Where to, do you think, Bruce?
My favorite group before the Beatles was the Coasters.
Yeah.
And fortunately, it also was one of the Beatles' favorite. And therefore, when they had their audition, the famous Decca audition,
When the Beatles had their audition.
one of the songs that they did was Three Cool Cats, and they returned to it during the Let It Be sessions. And because I'm a Coasters fan, I'm going to ask our wonderful engineers if they could cue it up and play it for us.
Let's take requests. One from Bruce. Here's the Beatles doing the Coasters. The group was on Atco.
Right. The Coasters, that is.
That's right.
The Beatles were on Atco,
right?
too, very briefly.
Sweet. And we had a note from Joe Santamaria of well, he'll kill me, too. It's hot in here, of Worcester, Massachusetts. And he writes, the demos we're listening to right now remind me of one harsh reality. The Beatles messing around, playing, singing, and eating sandwiches has more heart and feel and raw passion than anything you could hear or buy flipping the top 40 radio at this exact moment. You may not like every selection, but find me another group so damn interesting and I'll burn my White Album.
Right. I can't argue with that. Well said.
Oh, gosh. One of the things that we didn't talk about yet in all of this is a song that became the title of a movie and a record. Let It Be. Do you know why the name got changed from Get Back to Let It Be?
Well, Get Back was old hat by the time it finally got released. The idea in early 1969, we call it Get Back, and Get Back was the best song from the session. It was a rocker. It was a new hit single. But by April of 1970, Get Back was history. The song was well over a year old, so the idea was...
When did the single, do you recall when the single came out of Get Back?
Came out around May.
Yeah.
April, May, around that time. And so, they wanted a new, fresh title, and Let It Be was an excellent choice.
Paul found himself around the piano writing a lot. And I don't know where in time this falls.
Falls during the White Album sessions.
Is that right?
Yeah, he actually, toward the end of the sessions, started the song, but there wasn't time to record it because they were trying to finish the album. So he was going through a very hard time because the White Album sessions were very tension-filled. So it was his times of trouble.
And the Mother Mary is not
his
probably...
mom.
It was his
mom.
Not Mother...
Mary McCartney.
And not the Virgin Mary or the...
No, but Paul later said if people wanted to make it religious, that was okay with him.
Let's listen to a few different versions of Let It Be along the way. and start off with this, where you can just hear him sort of working it out on the piano. You're connected to a special live edition of All Songs Considered. I'm Bob Boilen. Email allsongs@npr.org and put your phone number in if you want us to call you.